Trade disputes among major economies have pushed the world to the brink of recession, and the non-stop back and forth between world leaders has left some experts seemingly clueless.
I used to be into financial analysis. Now I have to do psychoanalysis. I've had to understand what various world leaders are doing. This has never happened before. For me, this is really a form of masochism.
The latest drama was caused by this year's G7 summit in the French town of Biarritz, just days after the US and China slapped more tariffs on each other's exports. And after US President Donald Trump branded Beijing as an enemy, he struck a friendlier tone.
I have great respect, and I have great respect for President Xi. And I think we're going to have a deal, because now we're dealing on proper terms. They understand and we understand. But that's a great thing that happened.
Trump says the US has agreed to restart talks with China after Beijing reached out to de-escalate the dispute. And he's under pressure from other G7 leaders, whose countries have been caught in the crossfire.
Just to register the faint sheep-like note of our view on the trade war, we're in favor of trade peace on the whole.
What's bad for the world economy is uncertainty, and the quicker an agreement is arrived at, the quicker that uncertainty will dissipate. That's what we discussed yesterday.
Trump has also offered hope of a breakthrough on Iran, saying world powers are close to a deal. That could lead to easing of sanctions and more stability in oil prices. But German Chancellor Angela Merkel says a speedy resolution seems unlikely.
This is an incredibly fragile, long and difficult process that only risks being damaged by preemptive comments. We all have a big interest in a peaceful solution to a conflict like this, but it will not be easy.
Merkel says getting US support for diplomacy with Iran is a big step forward. But analysts say what they need most from the Trump administration is clarity. Paolo Montecillo, TRT World.
Well, for more on this now, Shaun King joins us from New York. He's Senior Vice President of the business advisory firm Park Strategies. And our correspondent Simon McGregor-Wood also joins us from Biarritz. Welcome to you both. Simon, can I get you to kick off our discussion? Now, there's a lot to unpack from this G7 summit, but let's start with the trade war. China, of course, isn't a G7 member, but both sides had ratcheted up their dispute in the lead up to the summit. Where are we now with that?
Well, I think in a better place, at least psychologically, than we were on Friday evening. You'll remember that as the leaders gathered here on Saturday morning, it was one of the issues which we expected to potentially cause fractious and disruptive conversations. This is the G7. People remember only too well how badly the previous G7 last year went in Canada when Donald Trump effectively walked out. China and the trade war is something that is alarming the other members of the G7, and it was pretty clear it was going to be an area of very sensitive discussion. Even Boris Johnson, who is famously friendly with Donald Trump, chose to raise on Sunday morning at his breakfast working session with Donald Trump, as you just heard in that package, his note of caution in support of free trade and trying to ratchet down this apparently escalating trade war. Fast forward to Monday evening, where we are now, and we have a much better mood with Donald Trump alluding to, not without some confusion, frankly, conversations that have come in the last 24 to 48 hours to his trade people from Beijing, senior figures, he kept repeating at the press conference, very senior figures, saying that China is desperate to get back to the table and wants to reopen negotiations. So in terms of the nuts and bolts of how to climb down for both sides, that remains to be seen. That's the devil is in the details with all these things. But in terms of the mood, following that press conference between Macron and Trump's ebullience over this issue, he's saying repeatedly that China is desperate for a deal. They can't afford the current level of tariffs against their trade. We are expectant of progress, but I think with all these things, it's very unpredictable, and the bottom line problems with world trade and the abuse of rules, etc., are much more complicated and will take a lot more time to fix.
Yes, Shaun, Donald Trump, as Simon said, alluded to the fact that perhaps China was more eager to get back to the negotiating table than the US is. But we know both economies have been hit hard by this bruising trade war. Who do you think is more keen to end this dispute, China or the US?
I can't really say. I think that China needs the US market more than we need China's. But Xi Jinping doesn't have to worry about re-election, and Donald Trump does. So who really knows what's going on or who called who? Both sides want a deal, but even if we got a deal, how do we enforce it? You know, China is a Leninist dictatorship. They don't let their own people vote. How can we expect them to treat U.S. companies fairly? I wouldn't expect them to do so in the first place. So we'll see what happens, as Trump famously says. But it doesn't look like anything real is going to happen anytime soon.
So, as you say, Donald Trump is facing a presidential election next year. Do you think that's a bit of a motivating factor behind his attempts to perhaps reach a deal on this trade war?
It will be, but at the same time, a lot of his voters support his soft stand versus Beijing. So even if they may be losing out, and the fact is that U.S. importers and U.S. consumers, by extension, are paying the tariffs, not China, as Trump insists, even if they are hurting economically, they still like Trump standing up to China as they see it. And, you know, trade matters less to the U.S. economy than it does for other countries. Only 27% of U.S. GDP is tied to trade, compared to, say, Sweden, where 91% of GDP is tied to trade. So China can hurt us less than we can hurt them.
Okay, now, Simon, the appearance of Iran's Foreign Minister Javad Zarif really took everyone by surprise at this meeting. Perhaps it was Emmanuel Macron's attempt at some stealth diplomacy. But do you think that managed to advance his attempt at getting the 2015 nuclear deal back on track?
Well, I guess given the dire predictions that we were all banding around Friday and Saturday about Iran and the difference in strategy between the G6, if you like, and the Donald Trump administration's very aggressive maximum pressure strategy. Yeah, again, in terms of the mood, psychologically, we're in certainly a better place than we had any right to expect going into this G7 summit. It appears, reading between the lines, that Donald Trump, to a certain extent, perhaps not that enthusiastically, has allowed this Macron initiative to go forward. It's going to be very complicated. It sounds to me like the Europeans, the G6, have at least accepted that it's not just a question of putting the 2015 deal back together again and getting the Iranians to comply, but it may be also about improving, deepening, stiffening the deal, creating a new deal, which was a surprising statement from President Macron on that. You know, the headline writers will be salivating over the prospect of a Rouhani-Trump summit in the next few weeks, but I think it's going to be very difficult to entice the Iranians back to the table if they realize that the deal they had in 2015 is no longer on offer. It's going to be a tougher deal for them. So I'm probably with Angela Merkel, who in that introductory piece was expressing her cautious skepticism about how tough this process is going to be.
Now, Shaun, we know that Iran's economy has been suffering greatly under the weight of growing US sanctions against it. Do you see the Trump administration's tune changing at all on this front?
Not really. I watched that press conference, and I want to say it was a pretty sneaky move by Macron to have the Iranian foreign minister there, just like it was a sneaky move for him to ambush Trump with that one-on-one lunch upon his arrival in Biarritz. And Trump would not have any problem talking to Iran because he's the one who's always said, let's talk. It's Iran who doesn't want to talk. But the way it was handled was kind of underhanded. I'd like to see what Trump does for a surprise for Macron when he comes to the G7 in the US next year. I think Trump has always said he wants a new deal with Iran. I don't think he's looking at going back to the JCPOA, which put Iran on the slow road to the bomb, didn't discuss missiles, and gave them a lot of money to finance terrorism against Israel and the U.S. in the Middle East. So I think he was being nice, but if you watch Trump and you know Trump, he was clearly saying he would only do a new deal with Iran, and he's still willing to talk to Iran. But I don't see Trump getting any closer to Europe on this issue as a result of what I observed this weekend.
Now, Simon, can I ask you about Brexit quickly? UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson was surrounded by European leaders who really want him to stick to the Brexit deal that was negotiated between his predecessor and the EU. Now, has Boris Johnson at all changed his tune on this?
No, I mean, he's going in hard on Brexit, as we know. He is telling everyone who's willing to listen that the 31st of October is the out date. Deal or no deal, come what may. That's what got him elected, arguably, to take over Theresa May's position. I think, again, reading the tea leaves, people in Europe at least are waking up to the fact that he means it this time. At home, he's spending serious money on making preparations for the no-deal disruption, to try and ameliorate those disruptions as best he can. He is looking at the meetings he had last week in Berlin and in Paris, where he was set this kind of deadline, if you like, this challenge on the Irish backstop, come up with viable alternative arrangements to keep the Irish border open, and we will listen. That was the line from both Merkel and Macron. His supporters back home in London think that was a breakthrough. I think it's a challenge. The noises from Brussels today behind the scenes are even more encouraging, I would suggest. I think they understand that he's serious on no deal. They don't want a no deal. The Irish certainly don't want a no deal. But the challenge he's set himself, or has been set, to come up with these technical solutions to keeping the Irish border open with all the complexity of the history and the Good Friday Agreement and goodness knows what else, as well as keeping the European Union market single and pure forever, it's a really tough call. Ideas have been bandied around before by the Brits on issues like trusted trader status, cameras, technology, tracking people. It's going to be hard. I think people are thinking no deal now is still the most likely option.
Okay, Simon McGregor-Wood in Biarritz and Shaun King in New York, thank you both again for your time.